In this lecture, we continue our discussion of teams. We ask the following questions. How do teams develop over time? Are there certain stages that a team goes through in its formation and development? Is there a downside to diverse teams? And can we be more specific about what those risks and obstacles are? What is groupthink, and how can it cause trouble for teams and leaders? And lastly, can we have a typology of teams? Are there different types? And are different types appropriate in different situations? Well, let's start with the premise that team design certainly does have a powerful impact on team performance, as we argued in the prior lecture. But I want to argue that process leadership still matters a great deal. You can't just set up the conditions for a team and then allow it to run on autopilot. Leaders need to help teams through the stages of development. They have to manage conflict. They have to intervene to convene the group at appropriate times, to manage the dialogue, to make sure the team is tapping into resources and knowledge and expertise appropriately. Leader intervention and process engagement matters. You can't simply set up conditions and let a team run on autopilot. Well, how does a group develop over time? Have we learned about that? And can leaders use that learning to drive better team performance? Well, many of you might be familiar with a very traditional model of group development that's often used in advising teams as to how they can come together and perform a task. This is Bruce Tuckman's model of forming, storming, norming, and performing. The concept here is that there's this fixed set of stages that a team goes through in its development. And generally, it proceeds through these stages in a somewhat linear fashion. Forming is the group coming together and members getting to know one another and each other's capabilities and perhaps their weaknesses. Storming is that period where clashes sometimes occur as the group members get to know one another, but also grapple with exactly what the goals are and how should they go about achieving the tasks. And then there's norming. Norming is when we see the establishment of certain ground rules, norms of behavior, rules of engagement, if you will, as to how the team is going to work together. And finally, if you can make your way through those three stages effectively, you can get to performing, where the group is now executing strategies that will enable it to achieve high task performance. Well, many of us have been trained with this model in mind of how teams develop. It's a fairly linear stage model. But new studies question the validity of those traditional models that many organizations have adopted in training and developing teams. Widespread use and acceptance of forming, storming, norming, and performing continues to exist despite research evidence quite to the contrary. So let's take a look at someone who's challenged that stage model. Her name is Connie Gersick, and she did a wonderful study some years ago of 8 teams in 6 different organizations. And she didn't just interview or survey these team members, but she observed every meeting. And for all but one team, she audio taped all their meetings. The team project length varied. Some projects were 7 days long, others lasted as long as 3 months. And the team meetings were frequent in some cases, as many as 25 times for some projects. Other times, the teams met as little as 7 occasions. She was there to watch it all, to capture their behavior, not just to ask them how they behaved, but to see and observe for herself the behaviors, the processes, the performance strategies, and the clashes among team members. And she developed a distinctly different model of group development than the classic forming, storming model. She found that group behavior tends to fit better with the concept of punctuated equilibrium, a concept that comes from evolutionary biology. What she's saying is, I don't see a linear process of team formation and development. Instead, I see this punctuation that occurs, and it happens around the midpoint of a group's work together. That means the midpoint may be a particularly useful time for leaders to exert influence over the performance strategies of a team. And it may be a time where they can coach the team to enhance the group's effectiveness. What's going on at group midpoints, according to Gersick? Well, groups are beginning to evaluate their finished work so far and identifying and beginning to address shortcomings, failings, flaws in the work that they've been conducting. Groups are abandoning false or inaccurate assumptions and premises, and they're discarding certain paths that they may have undertaken in the early stages of their work, and now they realize those are dead ends. There's definitely a renewed focus on deadlines, as they now realize that they're approaching the project's completion, and they're somewhat concerned about getting the work done on schedule. There's definitely a look, an examination of how the members are working together and interacting on a personal basis. Often at midpoints, groups reconnect with sponsors or champions within the organization. Who is it that set them out to achieve a certain goal, who gave them the resources and the mandate to go about their work? Well, they're reconnecting now to see if they still are in line with the expectations of those champions and sponsors. And lastly, at the midpoints, groups are coming to some agreements about how they're going to move forward. How will they allocate their work going forward? How will they collaborate? What are the phases they need to go through to get this project through to completion? So, team development occurs in a way that's quite contrary to what we've come to expect with that linear model that we've all adopted, that we've heard so often of forming, storming, norming, and performing. We have to think instead about midpoints and about that punctuated equilibrium that many teams go through, and what as leaders we can do in those critical moments at the midpoint, when teams can actually accelerate their performance, when they can discard paths that haven't been working. As we think about team process over time, we also have heard from many people that the ideal team problem-solving process has a certain balance to it, a balance between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is the idea that many different alternatives and options are put on the table, that people bring different perspectives to bear on a problem. And that kind of creativity and brainstorming is critical, particularly early in a problem-solving process. But then, of course, ultimately, we'd like teams to shift gears to engage in more and more convergent thinking over time. That is to say, we want them to begin to synthesize and integrate different perspectives, to begin to reconcile their differences, to find alignment and common ground, and to work toward consensus, ultimately. And there's a balance here, and it's not a linear process. Groups don't go through this stage 1 of divergence and stage 2 of convergence. They sort of iterate a bit as they brainstorm and then begin to find common ground and perhaps shift gears again toward more divergent thinking, toward seeking out more options if they're not pleased with the options that are on the table already. There are pathologies, though. There are problems that teams encounter related to this balance between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And there are two classic ones. The first is excessive divergence, where they are so focused on how differently they look at the world or look at a particular problem that they can never come together. On the other hand, there are some groups that experience premature convergence. They quickly come to common ground, perhaps too quickly. They focus very, very rapidly on one proposal or idea without looking at the full range of options that might be appropriate, without taking different perspectives, different vantage points on a problem. So excessive divergence or premature convergence can be key obstacles or perils that a team encounters. And there's a relationship between these process problems or pathologies and team composition. Excess homogeneity or heterogeneity can lead to excessive divergence or premature convergence. But composition alone doesn't drive these problematic outcomes. One can have these problems even with a wonderfully balanced team composition. That's why process leadership matters. Going back to the notion of a team of rivals, building the team, selecting the right members is just one step, but guiding them appropriately is critical if you're to avoid these pathologies associated with excessive divergence or premature convergence. What is it that happens to some heterogeneous teams? Well, diversity or heterogeneity in the team can mean a high level of cognitive diversity, and that's certainly a positive thing for team performance. Diverse cognitive skills, knowledge, expertise, all wonderful things we'd like to tap into to achieve an ambitious goal. But research shows that some highly heterogeneous teams experience what's called fault lines. In other words, teams can fragment, they can partition based on subgroups that naturally emerge. What happens is that people tend to gravitate toward others with similar demographic backgrounds when they work in teams. And so we have clusters emerging. And between and among these clusters, we may see deep fissures or divisions, fault lines, if you will. And that can be a problem, particularly in teams with high demographic diversity. The more demographic diversity in the team, the higher the likelihood that we'll see subgroups forming as people look to those who are similar to them in some way. That may not always be by gender or race. It may be because they all went to similar schools, or they all came from a similar industry, or they all have similar functional backgrounds. All of those things may actually cause them to cluster together in these subgroups and may cause fault lines to emerge. In one study I did, a fault line emerged within a senior management team around how long people had been at the company. There was sort of a senior faction and a junior faction. The senior faction had been at the company for more than 10 years. The junior folks all had joined the company within the last few. And so a fissure, a fault line, emerged within the team. How do they happen over time? Well, think of people as complex bundles of demographic characteristics. You know, I am someone from a certain school, of a certain race, of a certain gender. All of these demographic characteristics are bundled together in me, right? And everyone else in the team has a bundle. And we are assessing other people and their bundle, and we're looking for aspects of that bundle that are similar to us. And we're gravitating to others with similar characteristics. What that means is that we may actually have people becoming part of multiple subgroups based on different characteristics. So I may belong to one cluster that is people who've been at the company for a similar number of years. And then I may belong to another cluster, which is people of similar functional backgrounds, if you will. And what's happening is, as subgroups form, you then tend to see another subgroup forming with the opposing characteristics. Sort of one subgroup forms and another forms in response as people who don't have those characteristics then flock together in rebuttal almost. So what's the result of this subgroup formation process that's naturally kind of occurring over time within teams? Well, people sometimes begin to view their subgroup as an in-group, if you will, that they're very affiliated with, that they feel loyalty to, that's cohesive. And then the other group sort of becomes the out-group. And they begin to feel more identification with this little subgroup or cluster than perhaps with the whole team as a whole. So friction can start to emerge among these various subgroups. Interpersonal conflict, personality clashes can take place, and obstacles to information flow can result from these fault lines. And all of those problems can offset the benefits of the cognitive diversity that comes with building a team that has demographic heterogeneity. So fault lines are problematic, and we definitely want to be alert to them. How do we deal with them? How might we bridge the fault lines within teams? It's a very difficult question because there's no one way to do it, and the initial way, the initial inclination of many leaders might actually be wrong. So Grattan, Voigt, and Erickson wrote a wonderful article about fault lines and how we can overcome them. And what they pointed out is something a bit counterintuitive, that most leaders initially think the answer to bridging fault lines is to focus on socialization of members, to focus on the relationships, the interpersonal ties and communication among members. What they point out, though, is that focus on the social, on the relationships, may actually only exacerbate this in-group, out-group formation and tension. In other words, the more you actually focus on people's backgrounds and social relationships, the more you may actually be reinforcing these clusters and the fault lines between and among them. So this is very interesting, that the inclination of leaders when they see friction and personality clashes is to talk about the interpersonal relationships. But that may not be the best way to actually overcome the fault lines. What do these scholars argue? They say that first, of course, before you even put a team together, or as you're putting the team together and beginning to work on a task, you have to sort of diagnose the probability that fault lines may emerge. You have to assess the backgrounds of the members. You can't avoid it entirely. Almost any diverse team will have a certain risk for fault lines, because by definition, by building diverse teams, you will have people with complex bundles of distinctly different demographic characteristics. But you can't assess the risk. How likely is it that we may see clusters emerging, and in-groups and out-groups in opposition to one another? But then they argue that to overcome this, to bridge the fault lines, we ought to make sure we focus on the task and create energy around the task rather than focusing on relationships. Get them focused on a shared, compelling direction. And then we can make the switch from the task focus to the relationship orientation, to engaging in building relationships and social ties over time. But that compelling direction and goal that's associated with a task is actually paramount and should be focused on first, according to these authors. Of course, some teams have the opposite problem, right? They're not worried about fault lines. They're actually all together. There's great cohesion and unity, perhaps too much cohesion and unity. And of course, Irving Janis pointed this out when he outlined his theory of groupthink in his groundbreaking book published in the early 1970s. He argued that groupthink was a mode of thinking that people engage in when they're deeply involved in a cohesive in-group. He said in those situations, people can sometimes strive for unanimity, and that can override the actual kind of constructive critical thinking that will lead to good decision making. Well, this was a profound theory because he outlined it by going through a series of cases where teams of very capable, intelligent, experienced individuals actually made very poor decisions. And he looked at this in the context of American foreign policy, looking at presidents and their teams, their cabinets, and said these very capable people at times would engage in groupthink. They would prematurely converge on a single idea or proposal and not adequately engage in critical thinking, in alternative generation, and in the uncovering of hidden risks. What are some of the symptoms of groupthink, according to Janis? He said when cohesive groups begin to strive for unanimity, when they begin to think of themselves in this very strong sort of affiliation with one another, and perhaps, again, contrasting themselves with an outgroup of some kind, they may have illusions that they're not vulnerable to outside forces and threats. And they may begin to together rationalize and discount certain risks or warnings. They come perhaps to have an unquestioned belief in their own morality and goodness. And they may stereotype their views of their rivals, competitors, or enemies. And if someone, in fact, may be challenging the conventional wisdom in the team, then other members may be pressuring that person to sort of back off a bit. Or individuals may be engaging in self-censorship. That is to say, they're never even raising their concerns or dissenting views because they're worried about the fact that a majority seems to have already come to a strong agreement. And so there's this shared illusion of unanimity that emerges, where everyone sort of thinks that everyone else already has settled on an idea, when in fact what's happening is multiple people might be self-censoring what they really believe. And lastly, one symptom of groupthink is that certain people act, as Janis described, as self-appointed mind guards, who are essentially protecting the group from information that might actually shatter their complacency, that might shatter their apparent consensus. Well, what's the result? What are the consequences of this premature convergence and excessive cohesion, if you will? Well, the results of groupthink are that teams sometimes don't consider many options. They only talk about a few alternatives. And the alternative preferred by the majority is not really examined in a really critical way. We don't get a vigorous debate about the pros and cons and the risks associated with the proposal on the table endorsed by the majority. And we don't see unbiased experts being brought in to look at it from a different perspective and try to offer some information and expertise that might be useful to the team. We definitely see the selective analysis of information and data, with an emphasis on facts and data that will support the initial view of the majority. And there's very little contingency planning, very little discussion of the obstacles that the proposal may encounter during the execution phase. So let's take a look at a case study, one of Janus's famous case studies about groupthink. In my earlier decision-making course, I described the Bay of Pigs decision, which is a classic example of groupthink, when John Kennedy supported a group of Cuban exiles to go into Cuba to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. But Janus, in his seminal book, Victims of Groupthink, actually profiles a number of case studies of premature convergence. And he argues that we see this rationalization of warnings, these shared illusions and other symptoms of groupthink in a number of settings, including the wishful thinking displayed by naval commanders in Hawaii during the weeks leading up to the Japanese attacks on the islands. The attitude was, this will never happen to us. There's no way a foreign power would attack a naval base on U.S. property. There was this feeling that they were immune from any potential attack, argued Janus. Military commanders in Hawaii, including Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was commander of the Pacific Fleet, actually were given a steady stream of warnings in the months leading up to the Pearl Harbor attacks. In fact, in late November of 1941, Kimmel received a very strong warning from Washington, D.C. Quote, "This dispatch is considered to be a war warning. Negotiations with Japan have ceased, and an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days," unquote. So very clearly, Kimmel is hearing that a potential attack might occur. But how did he and other advisors discuss and consider these warnings? Well, they did talk about them, but they concluded that there was no chance that we would see a surprise attack by a foreign power such as Japan on a naval base in Hawaii. They concluded that they didn't need to worry. Now, this group was interesting. It actually included 4 key men who worked very closely with him on a daily basis. They were very loyal to them. They were a very capable and distinguished group, but they also are a group that was very cohesive and very loyal to Kimmel as their boss. Janus described them as a cohesive in-group with these tremendous feelings of loyalty. One officer described himself as a Kimmelite. He was very dedicated to working for this admiral. It was a very friendly group, too. They were warm with one another. They had strong feelings on a personal basis about each other. Now, Wohlstetter wrote a classic book about the Pearl Harbor attacks, and she took a look at why they may have discounted warnings. And she, in fact, points out at one point that there is this atmosphere of geniality and security within Kimmel's team. And at one point, there's a joke that's told, a rather unfunny joke, she says, that actually indicates how congenial this team was and how dangerous that geniality, an atmosphere of comfort and security was. Here is the story of this unfunny joke. She writes, "Somewhat perturbed by the puzzling loss of radio contact with the Japanese aircraft carriers, Admiral Kimmel asked Lieutenant Commander Layton on December 1st, 1941, to check with the Far East Command for additional information. The next day, when the Admiral was again discussing the lost carriers with Layton, he remarked jokingly, 'What, you don't know where the carriers are? Do you mean to say that they could be rounding Diamond Head at Honolulu and you wouldn't know it?' But he didn't say that seriously. He was joking as if that's just preposterous that that could happen. And this comfort, this atmosphere, they're joking about what turned out to be, of course, a very serious risk. It's representative of this pattern of wishful thinking, of shared rationalizations, of illusions of invulnerability, all characteristics of groupthink. And we see the confirmation bias in action here. What is the confirmation bias? That is the tendency for individuals to look for data that will confirm what they already believe and discount data that might actually upset that conventional wisdom. And clearly, Kimmel and his team are very focused on the data that will confirm their belief that there's no possibility of a Japanese surprise attack on U.S. soil. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the researchers discovered that on one ship, there were lower-ranking naval officers who actually were concerned about a potential attack. And these folks on the West Virginia, in fact, sustained far less damage and casualties. And that's because they had seriously debated and discussed the potential for a Japanese attack and thought about how to prepare and deal with it. It's fascinating that none of the senior people on Kimmel's staff had those kinds of discussions about how to prepare and deal with a threat like that. And what's also interesting is there's no evidence that junior officers from the West Virginia felt comfortable enough to come forward to discuss their concerns with Kimmel's staff. A classic example of groupthink, of self-censorship on the part of the junior officers, not coming forward to challenge the majority. Well, how do we prevent groupthink? Well, Janis learned a number of things by studying positive decision examples, including Kennedy's behavior in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He identified certain tactics and techniques that can be used to stimulate more critical thinking and debate. He argued that first, of course, just simply developing knowledge of this problem, raising awareness among leaders and team members about the possibility of groupthink can help combat the problem. But even more, we might take measures such as splitting teams into subgroups to generate and debate options, or assigning devil's advocates, or bringing in outside unbiased experts at times. All of these methods are there for the leader to use to draw upon to force that dialogue and debate and prevent groupthink, to ensure that some level of divergent thinking will take place before people crystallize their positions and perhaps prematurely converge on one proposal. So what are the conclusions so far from our discussion of team development and team process? Well, there are three key aspects of forming and leading effective teams that we've discussed. First, we have to understand the team development process and the importance of the midpoint course correction. We have to understand fault lines, how we might prevent them and bridge them. And we need some techniques in our toolkit for combating groupthink. The key message here is that team design is a necessary but not sufficient factor in driving high team performance. Hackman was right that team conditions matter, that building the right foundation is helpful. But I think he underemphasizes at times the importance of leader interventions in a group process. He perhaps has focused so much on that design stage up front that he hasn't accounted for how important it is for a leader to keep their finger on the pulse of that team and to intervene to guide them through problem-solving processes to achieve their goals. Of course, all of this discussion of teams, I do want to remind you that we have to think carefully about the task itself. There are those occasions when certain tasks simply are not appropriate for teams. Take creative writing. I've watched my students at times who try to collaborate on a writing task and how much they struggle. That can be a very difficult thing to do for a group. An individual may be able to do that task much more effectively. So we do still have to think about the fact that teams aren't always appropriate for certain tasks. We also have to think about the fact that there are different types of teams. And the legendary management writer, Peter Drucker, had a wonderful article once where he described three classic types of teams. And he drew analogies to teams and settings far from the field of business. He said one type of team is like an American baseball team. An American baseball team has a number of players who have fixed roles and positions. And their performance is largely independent of how others are behaving, that they can sort of act to optimize their own performance, and in so doing, they can help the team excel without a lot of interaction or worries about their effects on others' behaviors. But then we have an orchestra. An orchestra is quite different. People still have fixed roles within the orchestra, but now to perform well as a group, each person has to really think about how their performance interacts with and is dependent on others' behaviors. And finally, we have something like a doubles tennis team or a jazz ensemble. Here we no longer even have fixed positions. We have people fluidly interacting, moving all around the court in doubles tennis, and having to constantly sense and react to others. The question of what type of team do you want to form and lead begins with how much interdependence and integration is going to be required. High performance happens, according to Drucker, when you match the right type of team to the task at hand. Is this a task appropriate for a baseball-like team? Or do you need something that looks a lot more like a doubles tennis team? because there's a lot of interdependence and integration and synthesis that you'll need among the members. You know, this is something that I've seen in a number of cases of senior executives in business. And one case that Linda Hill wrote about Rudy Gassner, the CEO of BMG International, the music company, highlights the notion of different types of teams. Gassner formed an executive committee of the senior folks around the world for BMG's international music business. And in the case, Hill documents how team members are somewhat dissatisfied with the way the team is functioning. Now, some have their concerns about Gassner's style. Is he too autocratic? But a deeper reading of the case shows that what in fact happened is people have different expectations about what type of team they're on. Gassner's view is that this is sort of like a baseball team. I need people to establish and optimize their performance in their fixed roles. He's not so worried about them having to work interdependently, perhaps. Where they have a vision of joining something that looks more like an orchestra or a doubles team, a doubles tennis team. And so there's this misalignment between what kind of team am I on, how interdependent, how collaborative are we going to be? And that misalignment can in fact be a problem. So what are our takeaways? First, teams don't form in a linear fashion. They don't go through a set of stages one by one as they form and develop over time. Instead, they often experience a punctuated equilibrium. And so the implication for leaders is mid-course corrections are key. And that midpoint can be an important intervention opportunity where a leader can divert them from dysfunctional behaviors and get them on the path toward achieving their goal more effectively. You have to be on the lookout for fault lines as a leader. Where might we see these divisions between subgroups within the team? You have to build in mechanisms and techniques like devil's advocacy and subgroups and unbiased outside experts to help deal with the potential for groupthink that can happen even to the best of teams. You have to ask yourself, do we really need a team for this task? And if so, what type of team? And then make sure expectations are aligned. Are you expecting the team to behave like a baseball team? And do the members have the same expectation? Alignment of expectations will lead to the best performance.